Welcome to the Roniel and DaRon podcast show. I'm DaRon.
And I'm Roniel. The difference between a flaw, a bug, a risk, a vulnerability. All right. And with all of these terms, people kind of get confused on what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah.
Which it'll be better if we didn't have too many freaking terms where they are what they are. The flaw, the bug, the vulnerabilities. I mean, come on now. Like, do we need all of these fucking terms? I mean, that's cool with the bugs. It's different. But I think it's just people kind of get confused on what they really are, which is why I said they need to know what the difference between a vulnerability assessment, a risk assessment, and a penetration test versus a security assessment. Kind of need to know those different things. They're all different.
They're very different. And interestingly enough, as we discussed before, our industry has not solidified these terms, period, anyway, in general. Now, there is a very distinct difference between a risk assessment and risks versus vulnerabilities. Now, flaws and vulnerabilities, though, that's actually not a solidly defined thing yet. Our industry, plenty of organizations, plenty of major security organizations do not recognize the concept of a flaw because those that differentiate state that a flaw is a vulnerability that cannot be exploited. Not because you have mitigations in place, but because something's not hooked up or things of that nature. A flaw to some of those organizations is like if I wrote a new code and it's not hooked up to anything yet, so no one can actually call it, and I have a vulnerability in it, right? So if we were to actually hook it up, you'd be destroyed. But the problem is, first and foremost, it doesn't make sense because that flaw is still a vulnerability and that code can still be called. I'll give you a good example. So I recently was looking at a system and I pointed out a deserialization issue that they had. So there are many different ways that you can have insecure deserialization. In this particular case, they were using the struts2 JSON plugin. Now, the way that plugin works is if I specify a variable that has a setter, unless you explicitly tell it to not deserialize, it will deserialize. If I have a variable that is public, it will deserialize. If I have a setter method or something that looks like a setter method, so maybe there's not even a variable tied to it. Maybe it's just a method that says set pizza, right? I like pizza, so pizza's going to come up in my examples.
Yeah, you use it for everything. It's okay. DaRon, the pizza man.
That's right. It's amazing. I wish I could eat it more.
I hear you.
I have to keep my beautiful figure.
I don't think that's going to do anything to your beautiful figure. I mean, I'm sure that you can eat whatever you want and you'll still be okay. Yeah. Yeah.
No enhancement here.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, there are other organizations that define flaws as being a broader, more overarching thing, and vulnerabilities to them are actually a kind of flaw. So some have it flaws or vulnerabilities, some have it vulnerabilities or flaws, and some have it flaws are things that can't be exploited because that thing is not reachable. But as I was saying, it's interesting because you can have, for example, deserialization issues or remote code execution or buffer overflows or a variety of different mechanisms that allows someone to call to things that you don't think are hooked up. And that's one of the important things is you'll have all these development teams and they'll write all this code and they'll remove maybe some of the public interfaces to or public methods or whatever happens to be to actually access this defunct code. But that becomes moot when you actually start exploiting. Once I'm able to do anything where I can point to arbitrary code or arbitrary segments, I can bypass that. And that was one of the interesting things about this deserialization issue is because of the way the struts 2 JSON deserializer works, I can feed it JSON that calls to things that you don't want it to call to. And I can call all the way down your stack, and I can actually even call to a bunch of static methods. I can call to whatever makes me happy. And that's not something that most people would realize that you could wind up doing. But this is thanks to the beauty of modern computing. We've done all of this work to create all of these parsers that will translate something into code or code into something. But unfortunately, our industry has done a very bad job securing it, which means that if you do have this defunct code, it can still be called. It can still be triggered. And that's why if you have code that you're not using and you don't plan on using, remove it. We have Git, we have Subversion, we have all of these modern source code repositories. Branch or stash or whatever makes you happy, but remove that code before you actually compile it for production. Well, with that, we're going to leave off this episode, and I want to thank you all for watching.
Until the next time, don't forget to subscribe to the Roniel and DaRon podcast show and catch you the next episode. Signing off, I'm Roniel.
I'm DaRon.
Have a good one.
Have fun.